If not, that's okay. So we can get started with the questions. Panelists, you will have 2 to 3 minutes to answer each question, so just be mindful of the time. And the audience will have time for your questions at the end. So you can just write your questions on the text box, the chat box, and I'll read them at the end, or you can directly ask the panelists questions if you feel comfortable doing so. So are there any questions for me before we begin? Okay, great. So panelists, can you share with us how you are connected to Yemen? Did you grow up there? If so, when did you move here? Bushra, you kind of answered that, but just to go back and reiterate that.
Well, I'm born and raised in Yemen. I moved to the United States after the Saudi UAE led coalition started to bomb Yemen, and I left in June 2015. But I came here June 2016. So yes, most of my life was in Yemen, specifically in the capital of Yemen, Sana'a. Yes.
Thank you, Bushra.
I'll go next. I was actually born and raised here in New York, but I kind of, every year since I was about 4 years old, I was in Yemen, specifically between Aden to southern port city of Yemen and Sana'a as well in the north. And pretty much most of my summers were there. I really didn't spend the summer here in New York, frankly, although I wish I, had, but I couldn't. I don't think I was allowed to at the age of, being under my parents' rule. But that's basically my story from the back end.
So my parents were actually born in Yemen, and I've been to Yemen twice in my life, once when I was 8 years old and another time when I was 15. And I would usually go as basically like a summer vacation. And yeah, so I was born here, been here my whole life. But like my Yemeni roots and my Yemeni background was always there, because growing up in a Yemeni household, we always had, we're aware of our culture. So when I went when I was 8, I went to a completely different country than when I went when I was 15. When I was 8, it was basically a beautiful country. Everything like is going fine. People are thriving. And then once I went again when I was 15 years old, that's like when the conflict had just started, and I was so surprised about what I saw. So it sparked a desire in me to basically bring about change. Yeah, that's my story.
Thank you guys for sharing that. So how do you keep in touch with your roots living in America?
That's a very elaborate and question, and I think there are many ways. I think a lot of us would do that through our families. Specifically for me, I'm gonna be honest with you. I really fell in love with Yemen during the Arab Revolution, 2011 specifically. Before then, to be frank, I did not like Yemen. I thought it was just another country that didn't have electricity, and I was just very upset about traveling there. It used to be, I think, for me, it was like, it was like this notion of, oh, you're not doing well in school, I'm going to take you to Yemen. And so, that's how I kind of, thought about it. But then when I got involved with the country, actually, I was a high school senior in 2011. I left it in the middle, probably 2 months before my graduation. I was in threat of actually being left back because I left, but I still wanted to, experience the change. And I respected and admired youth, specifically in Yemen. There's about 70% youth population, so pretty much the upcoming generation. And so my parents then also opened a school in Yemen, and so I then just love the culture, the music, the dancing, the food, which is amazing, and just everything else about them. They're such resilient people. And honestly, I've learned a lot from Yemenis. I think being brought up here, I think me and Bilal can kind of attest to this. We here in the US, and maybe Bushra can, add on this, especially given her, extensive living in Yemen, we tend to take things for granted here in the United States. And that could be for any community. you know, whether it's the Paki community or, you know, any community that really longs for their country. We tend to take things for granted here. And so when you go there, you become humble. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of this whole journey, frankly. Oh, Bushra, you're mute. Yeah.
Sorry, I did the opposite. So for me, it's the opposite. I never imagined that I would live in the US. I always dreamt about coming and studying in the US, but I would go back. Actually, when I left Yemen, I thought that I'm just going to leave for 3 months and then Saudi coalition going to stop bombing Yemen. Literally, I still have my clothes. Everything is there. Just I left for 3 months and then I will come back to Yemen. But since then, I never came back. I love Yemen. I love Yemenis, definitely. I remember as soon as I reached to New York, I was just going to all the delis and just wanted to hug everybody, all the Yemenis. But yeah.
So for me, I basically had a little Yemen in my house. Growing up from like the age of 1 to 6, I'm only talking Arabic in the house, eating Yemeni food, listening to Yemeni music. And then once I got into school, once I started going to school, I basically adopted a lot of American culture. And then once I started taking vacations to Yemen, like I gained the love for the culture and like the people there. So like I said, like the 2 times that I went there, it kind of changed my perspective each time that I went. The first time I saw like the beauties of what it was, and like peace. There's like a lot of good stuff going on. And then the second time, it was a humbling experience. Like, hey, I'm in the U.S. I've had these opportunities. My parents have given me these opportunities. I've never had to worry about if I'm going to be eating the next day or not. So after seeing all this, that basically sparked my desire to basically help, because I was gifted with all of this. Why can't you don't really control where or like who you're born to. So yeah, that's basically how.
I forgot to answer though the question. If you could see my mini diwan, I just put mini couch in my house. That's how I missed Yemen. And I feel connected to it, and definitely with the spices and foods, and especially music. Like I never listened to Yemeni music as much as I lived in Yemen. But when I moved to America, definitely I would listen to more often Yemeni music than English.
I think it brings back a feeling of nostalgia, right?
Yeah, it's too much. Even my family, they're surprised because I never did it back in Yemen.
Thank you, guys. How do you feel, or do you feel you have a Yemeni community where you live?
Should I start? Oh, okay.
You could go. You go first.
For me, I have different experience, definitely, from the Yemeni Americans. I think, like, I love Yemenis so much, as I said, and they're the humblest people I ever saw and the most generous. Like, as soon as I came here and I told them I just left the war, they would give me bread and milk. Like, they're so generous. I have very few of the Yemeni Americans in New York, I would say, specifically. But I got shocked with how divided they are as a Yemeni community just in New York City. And how I noticed, not all of them, of course, but some of them, they inherited from their parents the previous Yemeni conflicts that the kids are getting from their parents. That's what made me so not very involved with the Yemeni American community in New York.
And you want to go ahead before
I? Sure. So do you feel you have a Yemeni community where you live? Personally, yes. Growing up, I grew up basically in New York City my whole life, which is a diverse melting pot, even in Ozone Park, like Queens. So oftentimes I would see like a lot of meet with people at the park, play around, play basketball, like all these different Yemeni families. And then when I would go to the bodega store, you basically know everybody from like each neighborhood. You know, this belongs to this person, and then you basically know each other. Yeah, it's pretty tight knit community here. So yeah, I would feel pretty connected to my community.
I think Bushra has a very good point. I actually do agree on that. I've been working in the community, specifically in New York, for 10 years almost, extensively. And in the United States specifically, there are different Yemeni American communities, and they all kind of fall into a different priority. So in New York, they're very much political. In California, they're very much into education. They don't get involved in politics. Tech in Michigan as well, it's a mix of both. And so Chicago's, again, there's a mix of different agendas and priorities. In New York, there's a heavy I would say very patriotic society here, regardless of your background or where where you come from. What's unique though about New York compared to all other Yemeni American communities in different states is that regardless of your view, although we take it very seriously, we're New Yorkers, so we're like boom, 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 1, 2, 3. But when you actually sit down together, you're all friends, and I think that's the uniqueness about New York. I feel like we still have a lot to go, and there's been a lot of accomplishments for the last 10 years, but there's definitely a need to kind of push more education on Yemeni roots and whatever is going on in the country and how it reflects to us here. In New York specifically, we have a lot of incoming Yemeni immigrants, new Yemeni immigrants since the conflict. So there's a lot of cultural clashes. There's a lot of confusion in how to approach this new culture. And so it all varies, but it's definitely a mixing pot for sure.
Thank you. And Bushra, you said that you feel Yemenis here are kind of divided. Is it the same, you were saying the same as Summer, or like what was your approach on that?
Yeah, they're divided, very divided. I was shocked from that. Yeah, that was one of my first culture shock.
So can you give us a brief history of what's going on in Yemen right now for those of us in the audience who may not know to the full extent?
Well, I will start from 2014 when the Houthis rebel controlled the capital of Yemen. And then in 2015, Saudi UAE coalition started to bomb Yemen. Since then, there is a siege around Sana'a, the north of Yemen. Yalla.
If you're not speaking, can you please turn off your audios? Thank you.
And south of Yemen is still controlled by the Yemeni government, which they are located in between the south of Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot of mixed conflict in the south, a lot of groups, and the Houthis are controlling the north of Yemen, which the majority of the Yemenis moved there or lived there. So the siege, I would talk about a short, long story, did cause a lot of famine, a lot of the diseases from the cholera right now with the COVID-19. Yes, it's a very, some or the others can continue, but it's a very big, huge, like long story. But it depends which part of it you want to focus about.
Yeah. So there's definitely focus points, but I mean chronologically we'll go there and just make it like bullet points. So in September 2014, a Houthi group, rebel group specifically, kind of overtook Sana'a. I was actually in Yemen at that time when that happened, and I could not believe my eyes. I had thought also that it's just going to be a quick thing, and everything's going to go back to normal like everything else. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. So they actually went up from Sana'a all the way, which is the north of Yemen, and then they moved downwards all the way to Aden. And what had happened was in March, from September up until March, then 2015, then the Saudi Arabian coalition came in to, as I quote, to kind of bring back the state that's questionable right now, but at that time that was the goal. And then moving forward now, I think 6 years on, nothing has been done, whether it's the goal from coalition or whether it's reinstating states or governance or whatever the case is. Houthis are still in the stronghold of the north, and in the south you have groups, also different armed groups. So Yemen right now is a melting pot of lawlessness, and I think, in my opinion, and right now, 6 years on, we have a humanitarian crisis. And how that happened was a mixture of many things: a mixture of lack of governance, a mixture of conflict, a mixture of economic crisis, which, by the way, in just a little fun fact, actually in the Arab Spring in 2011, Yemen was actually going through a humanitarian crisis, not necessarily to the extent that we're in now, but one of the reasons, around 40% of Yemeni population were actually unemployed. A lot of people did bring up that point in the Arab Revolution, given the lack of economic strength in the country. And then this conflict just made it 100 times faster and 100 times worse. And so it just kind of prolonged into a domino effect of many things. And until today, we're basically in a very, very bad situation on every level: politically, socially, even socially, everything, economically, all of that.
I agree with what was said. I think the 2014 events that Bushra talked about can be explained by 2011 events, the Arab Spring. So what the Arab Spring was, the goal was basically to promote democracy, economic freedom, human rights, employment, and they basically wanted an election. So they basically had a president who was in power for 34 years. The president stepped down and he handed power over to somebody else. And then in 2014, because the government was so decentralized, this group was able to be successful with taking over Yemen. And so other nations got involved. So the way I see it right now, it's basically like a proxy war. Other nations got involved, such as Saudi Arabia, Iran. There was basically rumors that the Houthi rebels are being supported by Iran in terms of weapons, power. So Saudi Arabia gets involved, and because they were afraid of Iranian influence around its borders, they started a bombing campaign. And within these bombing campaigns, the Houthi rebels would get caught, but also innocent people, hospitals, markets. And that's why what's going on now with Saudi Arabia, it's pretty questionable. Are these bombings effective if innocent people are dying or getting caught in the crossfire? Yeah.
I will add as well some points. So basically, the Houthis had already, the Saudis already had feared the Houthis since 2001, and there was a war against them from 2000 till 2009 from our previous president Ali Abdullah Saleh. But the difference, what happened in 2015, that Mohammed bin Salman, he got the power and he took over the entire country, and he just got so much power on his hands that he underestimated what he's going through to Yemen. So if you're going to ask me today, what does Saudi Arabia right now, what are they succeeding? There's nobody's winning this war in Yemen, either from the Houthis or all the local groups on Yemen or Saudi Arabia. The only thing that they're giving the Saudis to the Houthis, they're getting empowered every day with this war. Since 2015, I saw them with my own eyes in 2014 until today, how much power they gained with this war.
So is there a way of taking back that power and giving it to, like, back to the people?
There's so much going with the people. They're dying out of hunger. They have no salaries. There's no electricity. There's COVID-19. There's a siege around, it depends. Siege in the north of Yemen, the south of Yemen, they're being controlled with these armed groups. The people are so tired, but they're resilient and they're trying to find alternative ways to survive since 2014.
And Summer, you mentioned that Yemen right now is a melting pot of lawlessness. I really like that. Can you elaborate a bit more on that and like what that means?
Yeah, you know, when a state loses its governance, whether locally or on a higher level, there's a sense of chaos socially on a community level, and everybody then becomes their own soldier in a way where they have to defend their own selves. It's kind of questionable, you know. In the north of Yemen, you have the Houthi group, which is a rebel, you know, armed group, and they, like Bushra had said, they became stronger over time because of lack of strategy in general from every actor involved. They did get a lot of their military support from the previous president, who was ironically killed by the same group, which was the Houthis that he once supported. And that's a lot of political revenge and such. And it just ended up being something that fell on him. But essentially, you know, when some people say, you know, Summer, you know, why can't people talk in the north of Yemen? Well, you know, you're being silenced. There's activists that are getting kidnapped. They get, you know, into torture. There's a lot of concepts, unfortunate actions that are happening to people who do speak up. So they end up either fleeing the country. A lot of cases where a lot of Yemenis end up leaving because they're not safe. And then in the south of Yemen, you have a kind of an interesting situation where historically Yemen was actually a separate country. There were actually two different countries that unified in 1990. It wasn't the best unification, and so it became bloody. There was a civil war in 1994. So in the south, they saw Houthis coming in as a sense of war again, as a replica of 1994, and they have what you call the southern case in the south of Yemen, and there's a lot of grievances that had happened that needs to be addressed in the future. But then there was a bunch of groups. So there's Southern Resistance Group that happened in the beginning between 2015 to 2016, 17-ish. And then you got into the Southern Transitional Council, which was pretty much formed in I believe 2018, something along those lines, if anything, something mid 2018, late 2018, and anyone can correct me. And then they kind of mix the whole messaging of we're going to support the Southern cause, but at the same time, they actually are financially supported by the UAE. So it tends to be a little messy. And now both actually, everyone is now outside of the country. So while there are armed groups in the country, their leaders, whether they support or represent a case or not, they're actually in Saudi Arabia, either UAE, you know, some of them are actually in Turkey and such. So it's just a lot of just so many different, and Yemen, I came back from Yemen in August 2019. And it's so crazy because even in each neighborhood, there's a different, you know, group. And so you tend to, a lot of people get confused, you know, from checkpoint to checkpoint. I know that even when you travel from the airport from Aden all the way up to Sana'a, it's very complicated, very complicated. on the ground when it comes to, groups, whether they're sovereign or not. At the end of the day, again, it's just a lawlessness, and there's no synchronized effort to kind of, at least security wise, bring everyone together. So
Thank you for that, Summer. So what has caused the widespread humanitarian crisis to be at the extent it is right now?
So I would say it's three things. The first thing was basically a decentralized government, which is what they've been dealing with for a few years. On top of that, cholera outbreak. So because they don't have adequate health care, that's another problem. And then the third thing is right now they're battling COVID. And the way we battle COVID is completely different than they do it there. What they're doing there, they're trying to bottleneck entry points, and they don't even have adequate technology to basically figure out who has COVID or to test people. What they do is they use a IR thermometer. So basically it's some type of gun. They point it at it and they take your temperature. If your temperature is over 103, I believe, then they assume that you have COVID. But yeah, in terms of battling COVID, they're also having trouble with that. On top of that, the economy isn't doing too well. People are out of work, so they can't provide for their families. That's why donations go a really long way. And yeah, I think a combination of those three is making it worse.
Thank you for that breakdown.
I think there are multiple layers of this humanitarian crisis. I don't say it's just about the crisis, whether it's the conflict or whatever it may be, but essentially it's an economic crisis more so than anything else right now. What this conflict did, though, like I had said earlier, was it kind of made everything it fell in a downfall much quicker than normal. There's a currency issue right now with the inflation of the Riyal Yemeni. And again, it's because instability causes that to fluctuate. Decentralized government is really a really big problem here. And I think when you're dealing with different ministries and different authorities on the ground, that also impacts how you deliver aid. And I think that's really important to kind of take note. So you would have to work in different strategies. One of the most interesting things that came out of this conflict was, or at least for currently, is the standardized way of responding to Yemen's humanitarian crisis. So a lot of INGOs have, and I think, in my opinion, that we have to kind of relook how to approach Yemen's humanitarian crisis. I don't think the standard quo in terms of how to, just the food basket and that's temporary. It's not something that should be, highlighted in a way where it should be permanent. And so it's economics, it's politics, it's social issues, and then also, as Bushra had mentioned earlier, when it comes to public servants or civil servants, in that sense, when they don't have salaries, they end up being in a very horrible situation. And I'm sure Bushra can take note on other things if she has any comments.
I think you covered it. I would add just, again, the siege, it's horrible. And the salaries, imagine since 2015, the Yemeni people did not get their salaries. That's crazy. So yeah.
Yeah, so that just on the note of salaries, in Sana'a there was a central bank of Yemen. It has been moved.
Yeah.
It actually switched now due to the UN agreements or some sort of plan. They have one in the south, so it's just Aden, and they also have one in Hodeidah, which is northwestern province of Yemen. which Houthis are also in control of, including the port. With that being said, there was problems, either, again, lawlessness. So either there's looting involved in these banking systems. A lot of the times, actually in Hodeidah, it was just in June where that happened. I believe it happened once or twice in Aden as well. But again, lawlessness takes a huge impact in how to kind of approach these things.
Thank you, guys. So the next question, Bilal had mentioned a lot of countries are involved in the Yemeni war right now. And the prominent force right now, I would say, is Saudi. So can you explain how Saudi Arabia got involved, and how has Saudi Arabia's involvement affected the situation?
So
you get started.
you go first. Okay. So when it started, so once the Houthi rebels were able to basically decentralize the government and take over, Saudi Arabia, okay, they assumed that Iran was backing them up, that they were giving them weapons and all this. Saudi Arabia and Iran are basically like enemy countries. We consider them that. And so Saudi Arabia launched, because they were Yemen and Saudi Arabia, so Yemen and then Saudi Arabia is right on top. Saudi Arabia assumed that because of this, they were afraid that they were going to infiltrate their borders. They started a bombing campaign with the Gulf Cooperation Council. It's basically something that Saudi Arabia runs with other countries. And in the bombing campaigns, like they would try to target Houthi areas, but then I believe there's been like 19,000 attacks, and like innocent people, hospitals, schools, they would get caught in the crossfire. So that's basically its involvement. So whether what they're doing is right, that's questionable and up for debate.
Did you want to add anything, Bushra?
Well, yes. At the beginning, I would talk about my personal experience in Yemen when the war started. So when the war started, Saudi coalition, I call it Saudi UAE coalition. At the beginning, they announced that this war is going to last just for 2 weeks in order just to destroy the Houthi rebels' weapons, which is mostly, it was in Sana'a, which is the capital. And it was so funny because most of the Yemenis who lived in Yemen, we believed it. So everybody was shut down and we were locking ourselves in our house in order the Saudis do their job and bomb all their weapons. But they did not expect that it's gonna last more than that. Until today, they couldn't succeed at whatever they wanted to do, and they didn't know what are they getting themselves into. So if it's a question about if they want to just kill the Houthi rebels, they could easily just secure their borders since 2015, and that's it. This is my comment.
I think just to kind of add on that, and this is why chronological events are really important when we talk about Yemen's crisis, because I think one of the biggest problems here in the United States specifically is that the war, essentially, when you choose an average American, the war starts in 2015, which is very problematic in how we kind of create that perspective on Yemen, which essentially started about 6 months before or 7 months before. The first airstrike, and I was actually in Aden at this time. The first airstrike was actually by Houthis. They flew out an army plane or a jet, I don't know what you want to call it militarily wise, and they actually airstriked it into Aden at the presidential palace. And it was actually probably like maybe a 15-minute drive from my house. And that was a huge sign of danger and worry that a plane could actually, within Yemen, before an intervention came in, can actually come and do that. And so it created really chaos in the city. When it comes to the roles being played, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, other countries, again, there's a lot of politics involved when it comes to the Gulf. Iran, you really played a huge role. I remember actually Sana'a, not Sana'a, I was actually passing by different provinces nearby Sana'a. And, a lot of the times I have experience with either the leader, and not everyone may have seen this, of course, depending on where and who the checkpoint was exactly. There is, the same stereotype and the same mentality when it comes to the ideology is very much synchronized to Iran. Now, I want to make clear that Houthis are a minority in Yemen, and we have kind of blew them up in a way in the media where they sound like the majority. They're really probably the smartest. I mean, if somebody can clarify on that, but they're the minority, and they should not be forcibly in control. And by the way, even Saudi Arabia, UAE, they can't intervene. This is a sovereign country. Athene has history, has civilization, and while this may be problematic, I am hoping that this is a transitional period, although a very devastating one, frankly. But I think, as Bushra mentioned earlier, that this country is so resilient. Whether it was one country or whether when it was separated, we've been through the Ottoman Empire, we've been through the British, the British takeover and the colony. It's just so many historical wars in the country, but we always prevailed. So I'm hoping that this is the same concept here eventually. And I don't think anyone, especially the upcoming youth, will eventually kind of take this as a new way of life or a new normal, as we say here in the States. It shouldn't be that case.
Thank you, guys. So I'm aware that there's a blockade in Yemen right now. Can you explain what that is for the audience, and if it's legal, and what other countries or organizations have done to question and stop this blockade?
Samar, since you're working with the aid in Yemen, I think you're the best to talk about this.
Looking at the camera. Yeah, so I'm going to remember what you said, but you were saying, how does this blockade essentially affect how we approach Yemen, through whether humanitarian assistance or not? Just to be clear, the Sana'a airport is closed, and that's something that was brought up in the UN Stockholm dialogue at one point. I think it was like a year ago. Unfortunately, there was a lot of technical details that the Houthis did not agree on, including a security check, I believe, from Saudi side. They wanted their sovereignty when it comes to flights internationally, which I don't think would have even passed given the pressure from everyone. But regardless of that, the port in Aden is open. We take in a lot of aid. The port in Hadid is also open. Now, what I found interesting, given the work that I do, and I have attempted to do both ports, in Aden, it takes me about 2 weeks, give or take, to kind of clear a shipment, get everything out of the port and, distribute it. In Hadida, I found that there was a lot of purposely portrayed, work in trying to make things more problematic to get a release of shipment for one reason. And I think there's always something called politicizing humanitarian aid. I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of politics in humanitarian work, whether it's from INGOs, that are pushing to kind of get certain groups to have more support than others, whether it's sending aid to Sana'a rather than Aden or vice versa. But other than the airport, in terms of the ports, they're open and they're really much in work, other than Sana'a airport. I know Aden airport is open, and obviously that's the only international airport aside of sometimes the opening of Hadramaut's airport. I think it's Sayoun airport. But that's how I see it in terms of the ports. I mean, if somebody, anyone can justify or, debate that, that's also workable as well.
I will add a point. So one of this is what I think one of the most dangerous, and that people in need in Yemen, in Sana'a especially, is the airport to be open, because it had been closed since 2016, the beginning of 2016. And the majority of the Yemenis, they live in Sana'a. So for example, if somebody is sick, he cannot leave unless he's gonna go travel to south of Yemen, which is 7 to 8 hours, or to Sayyun, which is my mom and my siblings took it. It was about 20 hours. People are really suffering to get out of Yemen sometimes, even if they're, let's say, middle class or upper class from Yemen, they want to leave and they have the money, they could leave, but they're having so many problems, and especially the sick people. And a lot of people, they're dying in the road, either to Sayyun or to Aden, in order just to catch the plane and to go to Jordan and to have health treatment. That's one of the most saddest things I have ever seen.
So Summer said the ports are open. Why is there so much difficulty in leaving?
So I'm talking about Sana'a, which is the capital. It's in the north of Yemen. There's a round siege by Saudi coalition. So for example, when I left Yemen, I went through Saudi Arabia, first transit. They had to check the plane for 10 hours. And then I had to leave to Jordan. So Yemeni people that was in 2015. Right now, I'm not sure how do they do it, but Saudi government needs to give the okay for the Yemenis to leave their countries.
Bilal, did you want to add anything? No, that's okay too.
I agree with what they've said. I think they've covered it pretty well.
And the second part of that question was, are other countries doing anything to question this or to help?
Samar, do you want to start?
I think the international community has done poorly in Yemen. I think, in my opinion, whether it's on a political side regarding, even on a humanitarian side, there's just a really poor job. From the humanitarian side, we can say that the mechanisms in place to kind of intervene in Yemen humanitarian-wise through aid and other projects have been standard, and I don't think it's I wouldn't, as a Yemeni myself, I really we're a tribal country, so we tend to really focus on dignity and the preservation of dignity. And I think the business model of what the international community has done, specifically the INGO versions of their approach, have been poor. I think that there could have been so much better work. From the political side, the whole intervention is wrong. The approach is wrong. The conversation is wrong. Yemen's problem is, well, it's not its problem actually. Yemen is a great country, and but the problem is the international community does not want to solve the root crisis of our problem, and that's why we're here today. Because in 2011 it wasn't also solved. And so it's just a repetitive of conflicts. I think there are ways to kind of look into Yemen, and I think the first is to sit down, solve our problems together. And I think in terms of federalism or in terms of separation, that conversation is a Yemeni conversation, period. And I think that even from the southern side, they have a really legitimate case that they need to kind of approach. But again, it's the international community always pushes things and say it's not the time, not even just for the southern case, but more so even the case of Taiz, which is a central province that's also under siege. humanitarian wise, I mean, there is just so many problems there itself, whether it's blockades in terms of the roads itself, you know, when you distribute aid, whether it's travel, as Bushra had said, it takes what used to be an hour drive is now 7 hours. I mean, there are certain ways that still not approachable. They think that the minimum is better than anything else, and that's not how we want to, you know, approach Yemen.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to add anything to that?
Yes, I will add. My opinion is Yemen had been cursed because we are sharing the borders with Saudi Arabia. Eventually, Saudi Arabia really controls the media so much, and they're one of the biggest donors for the international community. I think that's one of the reasons the international community had failed time after the time to the Yemeni people. As well, they really don't value Yemeni lives. They just don't care. The last time they were talking about it, and it gets some hint in the media after the Saudi journalist Khashoggi got killed at the Saudi embassy in Turkey. And that was unfortunately giving the right attention to Yemeni case. I really think Yemen is not complicated as much as like Syria. I think if the international community had the will to push all the parties to have a solution, they would do it if they just have the will. But they just don't care.
And to actually to the note, Yemen, and again, it's really not anyone's fault. I think it's just perspective that's being put out there that Yemen is a very rich country, very rich country. And when people say it's a poor country or they're going through poverty and such, unfortunately, it's just the lack of leadership and lack of mechanisms in place. Yemen, if left in its way with appropriate leadership and outstanding local governance, it could surpass the Gulf countries by 100. It's just a strategic location. Its important location is actually between the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, and that is alone a huge. And while it is a curse, unfortunately, I think that there's some blessings within curses as well. And I think, you know, our strategy is that we don't have the leadership that, you know, we need to kind of take Yemen to another level, unfortunately.
I agree. I also think the UN needs to get involved and basically arrange a national dialogue. I think countries who have their own political agenda, they should be charged with war crimes for what they're doing. Yeah, so basically arrange a national dialogue and basically solve the problem in Yemen rather than just one side doing this, the other side doing that. And yeah, that's what I think.
And there was, from my knowledge, there was a national dialogue conference, and I'm sure Bushra was there in the country at that time, and Bushra can speak on that given her, you know, situation living in Sana'a where the conference took place. But I think the conference was a really great opportunity to kind of relook Yemen in a way where it's fair and balanced. There was a session to actually reconstruct the Constitution, really put down provinces in terms of federalism. It kind of gave some sense of dependency, and then also, which is important, I think, to decentralize certain things, but not necessarily the whole government. Because I think Yemenis, again, every area has some grievance, and they want to kind of solve it some way. The United States was a very much backer. They spent a lot of money on the National Dialogue Conference, probably too much in my opinion. But what happened was there was a coup, unfortunately, right before the signing, and by the Houthis. And again, that even though the Houthis did agree on it, they, unfortunately, on the back end, there was political actors trying to create some sense of chaos because, again, unfortunately, no leadership, a lot of jealousy in terms of politics. We're talking about dictatorships. And then all of a sudden, everything can grow and prosper. It was something very, unacceptable. And so the national dialogue, and I still believe that we are headed to a certain sense of federalism, while it's still very cloudy. I think that there's a form of that somehow, some way. But the UN, as much as they've attempted, and I don't think they'll ever get it in Yemen. And one of the reasons is, again, is the approach. It's wrong. There needs to be an approach of doing things from zero up rather than starting from 100 and then moving down. I think that's, top-down approach is not appropriate here. And I don't think the UN could have solved it. I think the US could have helped solve the crisis in Yemen early on, between 2015, 2016, during the fresh part of the conflict, but it kind of also prolonged. So we've been actually in a situation where war also generates money. So there's a notion of that as well. So until when, I always tell people positively, listen, wars always end. It always ends. My concern is when that war ends, internally, Yemen is going to be struggling. And what happens is now the West, specifically the US and Europe, they're very much into Yemen right now. When Saudi Arabia got involved, and I definitely see Americans tend to have an anti-Saudi approach with many things, and you know what? That's their decision, that's their perspective for many reasons, and they're legitimate reasons. But I can guarantee you, once Saudi Arabia is out and about, hopefully, at least from a perspective of conflict and war, nobody will talk about Yemen anymore. I mean, you can mark my words, nobody will talk about Yemen. And it's because of that problem where I'm fearing about what's next, not necessarily at this time.
Thank you for that. So the next question, how does the Saudi-led coalition justify the blockade right now?
As I mentioned before, securing their borders. They're afraid if the Houthis gonna leave north of Yemen, controlling the Houthis. That's what I know, most of their justification. But apparently they're not doing a great job. It's just trying to squeeze the Yemeni people, the Yemeni citizens.
Thank you. Does anyone have anything to add to that? Okay.
Yeah, I think she covered it. And same thing as before, the borders basically playing a role.
Thank you. So follow the next question. Why does the US fail to acknowledge the Yemeni crisis?
That is a very, very complicated question and a lot of people say the same thing. Why is the international community ignoring Yemen? Why are they not supporting Yemen's transitional process? And it's a lot of geopolitics. I think, again, this notion of Yemen's a poor country, even though very strategic, I think it's actually one of the most important countries in the Middle East, given the international security background. But it's a very philosophical question, and I wouldn't be able to tell you except that Yemen is the back door of Saudi Arabia, and unfortunately, that's how a lot of people look at it as. Meanwhile, I think, in my opinion, it's actually the front door of the Gulf country. I think, what happens in Yemen will eventually spill over and will impact how security is in the Gulf, whether they like it or not. I think, like I said, strategy is missing. But I really don't know. I mean, I would love for someone to actually answer this constructively. I would love to learn about that.
Thank you for attempting to answer that. And if you guys have anything else to add.
I will add, definitely Saudi Arabia are the biggest allies to the US. Obama started to support the war. And there's New York Times documentary how they started supporting Saudi coalition. And then Trump came, unfortunately, made it 10 times worse. And Trump is making a lot of money. And I think part of it is because he's doing a lot of money with selling the weapons.
Obama is
Yeah.
definitely not as clean as we assume him to be.
Mm-hmm.
They basically have like a economic agreement. U.S. Saudi Arabia, they make money. So for the U.S., it's more like a economic thing. They don't see it as like a humanitarian thing. As long as they're making money out of this, which is wrong, but it's kind of how they see it. Saudi Arabia is basically like its best friend.
And fooling the Americans to making jobs out of the weapon industry. Above that.
Thank you for that. Bilal, you had mentioned how COVID is affecting Yemen right now. That was one of our questions, how it's affecting the country and what can we do to help? Bushra, Summer, you had mentioned that just sending like food baskets is not enough, because that's only temporary and it's not enough to get Yemenis back on their feet. So what else can we do to help?
Yeah, so for COVID-19, unfortunately, it's and the beginning of the crisis globally, right? Yemen was not listed as, having cases, and one of the reasons is because we don't have the sustainable or the resources and supplies to actually identify it, and so the health sector is actually non-existent in Yemen, I think, in my opinion. I mean, we're talking about hospitals using items post-Soviet Union. I mean, it's just a really horrible situation. In Yemen, there's less than 400 ventilators, which is absolutely ridiculous for a country of 40 million. Yemen as well had only certain, maybe less than 2,000 testing kits at one point for the first 2 months, not enough whatsoever. It eventually spread community level. And once that spreads community level, it's hard to control. The point of testing is to trace, from my knowledge, and we can't do that in Yemen. So actually in Aden, essentially the local administration that actually prints out death certificates in the month of May. What used to be before COVID was about 10 to 12 deaths a day, essentially from other diseases such as cholera, dengue fever, things like that. But now it reached to 150. And I mean, we're looking at mass graves at this point. There was level, and the Sana'a as well. In Sana'a, and maybe Bushra can kind of talk about this, and in the area of Sana'a, there was also secrecy of dealing with COVID cases, hiding the real amounts, I guess, maybe to kind of showcase that Houthis have everything controlled, or as they say, preventing chaos and emotional deterrence. But to actually, from an educated perspective, the more you know, the better, to kind of approach COVID. So that didn't obviously work out. We are talking about around 6 labs in Yemen only for COVID cases, which is again horrendous. There are hospitals that actually closed down, because they didn't have PPE, which is really important, given the notion of the spread. And so, what happens in these cases? And one of the problems with Yemen is that everyone is now dependent on humanitarian agencies, which is a problem. And once these humanitarian agencies lessen their programs and their, projects, they tend to kind of fall into a gap. And so COVID would be the same thing when it comes to the health sector. A lot of WHO, UNICEF, things like that, they have these programs up. But when they don't hit their pledging, that affects how we approach COVID also on the ground. I would say the best way to kind of support Yemen is to, well, you know, there are two approaches to Yemen, and I think there is an approach of rebuilding livelihood, and then there's an approach of urgent intervention where there's fresh conflict. I agree on both sides. I prefer personally a much more long-term program. I think it just gives more people things to do, and also it supports them longer, but not just giving them and moving on, teaching them how to get back on their feet. And Yemenis are very brilliant people. We have such amazing Yemeni diaspora out of Yemen, in scientists, in the med field, and, you know, heart surgeons. I mean, they're just beyond brilliant, but they don't have the necessary tools. So with that being said, I think, again, there needs to be a reapproach in how we look into Yemen's humanitarian. Sustainable development is key. Green energy, agriculture. That's the way you get people to feel hopeful again, that they feel worth something after such a horrible situation since 2014. And I think maybe if somebody wants to add on that, that would be great.
I will add, I agree with Samad with all her points. I will add as well, hundreds of hospitals get destroyed from this war, and mostly from the Saudi coalition and the Houthis rebels. So imagine right now, after these all hospitals get destroyed. So that was my only point.
And this is why it's important to kind of, again, reapproach Yemen. Over time, I think my personal goal, and I think every goal of any person who really cares about Yemen, is rebuilding it in a way that's sustainable. And as someone who has an organization, a humanitarian, who does, it's technically a very, you know, strong organization. I would love to see one day I can tell people publicly, I'm closing down Yemen Aid because there's no need for it anymore. And that is really important. Now, how far we're going to be until that happens, I wish today, you know, or yesterday before, you know, today. But the health sector is destroyed. The conflict has impacted that schools. There are more than 2 million children out of schools. The health sector, I believe there are, I think 50 to 60% lack of capacity. Most of the hospitals are closed, and the ones that are actually open have no operational support whatsoever. And I'll give you an example of just how the approach is wrong in Yemen. A lot of these INGOs, they tend to deliver, for example, ambulance cars to Yemen, and they say, here, you know, this is good for the, you know, emergency EMS services, but they give it to them and they don't support them financially, so they end up, you know, rusting in the parking lot because at the end of the day they can't really utilize it. And so where Yemen Aid comes in is that we actually look into those gaps, we support them operational wise, so we can actually flip the process. So we've actually taken ambulances where they've been delivered by WHO and they've been left aside, and we actually take that and support them. So there are certain ways to kind of approach it, looking at the gaps, and they don't cost much, by the way. I swear to God, it's mind-boggling what an ambulance service is to actually employ people, to support people, is roughly around $1,200, which is nothing per month. So that's pretty much New York rent, frankly, if you ask me. So you know, it's just mind-boggling. The standard vision of humanitarian aid needs to change. It could be in Yemen, it could be in Syria. It's the same problem across the board. So yeah.
Did you want to add
Yeah.
anything, Bilal?
Yes, Bilal.
I agree with what was said. Basically, the first thing to do would be urgent intervention, stop the war, and then from there, like Summer said, just rebuild the country, like the health sector, economic sector, the whole country. I agree.
And I started to feel lately with a lot of donations, not a lot, but some of donation lately happened to Yemen. And I started to feel from the people that it's out of a guilt they would donate, but they're not going to push for peace to Yemen. And I think that's unfair for the Yemeni people. They deserve to live in dignity. Your donation for one day, it's not gonna save their lives.
True, it is true. It's part support, and then it's also part advocacy and awareness. at the end of the day, the goal is the same. The war needs to end. The longer the war is, the more devastation it will kind of, put forward on the Yemeni people. So definitely it's two approaches. And whatever stance you have, I think it's kind of interesting that whether you're anti or pro or whatever it may be, it always ends up leading to the same thing. It's the end of conflict. How we get there is different from different approaches, but I think definitely the longer it is, just the worse. And 6 years on, I think we can all agree that that's just pretty much the case.
Thank you, guys. And our last question, before we move on to the audience questions, is despite the current situation, how can Yemenis still be hopeful about change going forward? Just to end on a positive note,
We have to end positively, or else it's just a really sad show. Maybe I think I would like to hear Bushra's perspective, because she was living there and that's her home, and now she's out of the country because of this conflict, and I'm sure things will change, and it unfortunately has in Yemen. But for me personally, I look at Yemen's history. I see the amazing resilience, the leadership that we had once had, the success in approaching civil society and a rebuilding the state. And I think Yemen will prevail, whether, like I said, whether it means, socially, whether it means politically. I think at the end of the day, I don't think any Yemeni would love to live in conflict. And whether it's intervention by different countries. And I also don't think no Yemeni would like to live under militia coup either. I mean, it's just, we're sandwiched in between multiple things. And at this point, where do we go? There's just so much. When you turn around, you see something. When you turn to the left, it's just problematic. But resilience is key. Yemenis are brilliant people. I think the next generation is so key. I don't think the leadership that we have will eventually be permanent. There's always transition, and eventually the next new upcoming leadership will come about. And I think ever since this conflict happened, while I think it's very bitter and unfortunate, I think there are things that happen to be good from it, which means that a lot of Yemenis ended up leaving the country. They started looking at the world differently. They started gaining the different opportunities, their brilliance, and they're bringing back all of that to Yemen eventually. So that's why I do what I do. That's why Bushra is activist. That's why she brings up the story. And I think that's why Bilal is doing medical, from what I know, is that, he wants to bring back the health sector and he wants to support Yemen after what it was lost. And I think this is really important. Everybody has a role to play.
For me, sorry, Bilal, go.
Okay. I also agree. I think you can basically never lose hope. All conflicts, if you see throughout history, they always come to an end. At this point, the most important thing is trying to end the conflict as soon as possible, and then from there, you can basically rebuild the country anywhere it's lacking.
Yeah, from what I saw, when Saudi started to bomb Yemen, I saw a lot of people started to find alternative ways to live. And I hate when people says, oh, maybe Yemeni people started to get used to it. It's not getting used to it. It's just finding alternative ways how to survive. And they're so peaceful. They just want to live in peace. And for example, the electricity, they had alternative ways so far. The gas, unfortunately water, they don't have water. But they always find a way to survive and try to live peacefully. And a lot of people in Yemen, they're not part of any of these conflict groups. They really just want to rebuild again the country. So there's always hope. If I'm seeing every day, I'm talking to my family back in Yemen, how they're trying to live normal life, even though they're controlled by one of the ugliest and Houthi rebels on the ground, and there's an airstrike from from the sky, but still they're trying to continue living their lives.
Thank you, Bushra. Did you want to add anything else, Bilal?
No, it's good.
Samir, you said, I liked one thing that you said, war doesn't last forever. You know, there's always going to be light at the end of the tunnel. Like, just having that mindset going forward, I think it is very important. So just to go into the questions from the audience, I think we have one. Erica says, Bushra, I think you brought up a really good point about people donating right out of guilt. What tips do you have for our youth to support and advocate for Yemen sustainably?
When I came to the US in 2016, I remember nobody knew about Yemen. Like, I was so mad. I would scream to people like, how the hell you don't know about Yemen? And I think right now there's a lot of people knows. I think advocacy makes a pressure on all kind of levels, even the students, even the youth, sharing what's happening in Yemen. That adds pressure on international community. So talking and by sharing, I think there is a power in it. For me, as a Yemeni living in the US, I love when I see people are sharing about what's happening in Yemen. People deserve peace. This is what's happening in Yemen, plus donation, of course.
Is there any more questions? Well, if not, thank you, panelists, for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate it, and just for educating us. And I know a lot of us, even including myself, I didn't know to this extent, and I feel like I'm walking away with a lot today. And I hope the audience feels the same. And if you guys can have like a last remark that you want to add before we close the night, feel free to do so.
So I'd like to thank you guys for arranging this. It was pretty awesome, like raising awareness. I noticed like this like movement kind of started moving on Instagram. A lot of people were sharing, and just like arranging this is pretty good. Like let's like not just stop it here, but like tell your friends what's going on, and so like real change could come.
And I think I would say, don't be shy. Ask a Yemeni. I mean, it's like those free hugs type of thing. Just come up to us, and we're really nice people. We'll probably, open our doors to you, frankly, and give you some tea. But essentially, ask us what's going on. It's complex, and I can tell you, even academics and experts that have been working on Yemen for decades are still trying to get it, and every day it's something new for Yemen, for us, even as Yemenis. Every day there's just new development and something we have to kind of learn. But I really I think we all appreciate your support, your advocacy, bringing up on Yemen. It was a trend like 3 weeks ago. It was amazing. We're so excited. We're probably thinking like, finally, it's long overdue, so keep it going. Talk to your local representatives, contact organizations, question them, honestly, question organizations, be that credible person for Yemen.
I think there was another question in the chat.
There's another question. I can't find it. Can someone read it?
How do we ensure the money is going to the right people? It said, in regards to donating to organizations, a lot of organizations, big and small, lose credibility because we don't know where the money goes. Once the money hits the fan, many people, yeah.
That's important. One of the first things that any person should do is do their due diligence when it comes to financial records. I think that's really, really important. A lot of people claim they're doing work in Yemen, but they do very minimal work. You'd be very surprised. even to a level where I think, Bushra, maybe you also know that a lot of people end up questioning, is this really going to Yemen? Or I don't see this, or, all of these comments. So financial auditing is so crucial, especially for organizations here in the States. When it comes to when the money hits the ground, many people demand a bribe. I think it's what you make of it in Yemen, honestly. And there are times where organizations tend to get pressured into that corner, but you actually have the obligation to say no, and walk away. And that's what leadership is about. If you end up doing that, you're part of the problem, frankly. So it just really depends on the policy of the organization. If it's about bribes, don't do it. I mean, as much as it sounds horrible about not supporting a certain area or whether a certain district, but is it worth it when 10% of this aid goes somewhere else where it should be? It shouldn't be. And so, be upfront. You are, as an organization, are in control. It's not the other way around. So even for us as Yemen Aid, although the minute we hear opinions from ministries, whether it's the Ministry of Health, whether it's whatever it may be, we give them that opportunity to give us an opinion, but the decision is ours at the end of the day. But unfortunately, not a lot of that is kind of done in Yemen. A lot of the times the ministries end up doing the work without a say by the INGOs. And I think maybe because Yemeni is a Yemeni American organization, we tend to kind of know how to communicate with our people, so we have that leeway. So if we say no, it's no. I mean, that's it, pretty much. So, but yeah, I think definitely auditing. If it's in the United States, ask for their financial audits. Be upfront about it.
I also want to address something about that. So I actually started a fundraiser on Facebook. I don't know if you guys saw it. And me and my friends, we were looking for an organization.
Please share it with us.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Just please share it with us whenever you get the chance.
Me and my friends started basically a donation. We were looking for an organization. And like I always heard, like Islamic Relief is like basically every like NYU, MSA uses it, this like, and a lot of others. So I looked on their website and it says for every dollar that goes into donation, 74 cents goes to where it's like actually like what's the cause. The other 26 would be planning events and other stuff. So once I saw that, I was surprised. I was like, is the money like 26% of the money really just like not going to where I thought it was? So then I spoke to my dad and I was like, hey, like, and we were really adamant about doing this. You want to raise a lot of money, an organization. He recommended Yemen Aid. And personally, like from what I've like seen, like amazing organization, pretty clear. Everything is email. Like, yeah, I can't really ask for a better organization from like the research I've done. Thank you, Summer.
Thank you for sharing that, Bilal, and definitely send us the link so we can share it on our platforms as well. And if there are no more comments or...
I do want to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Brown Girl Voices will be donating all proceeds from our Redbubble store to Yemen Aid. So if you guys do want to check it out, it's just merch we have on there that you guys can support both Brown Girl Voices as well as Yemen. And we'll definitely be open about exactly how much we made, and all the profits that we do make in the next coming weeks will be donated to Yemen Aid. We'll be posting a graphic later tonight where you can find the link to our shop, and hopefully you guys can help support Yemen.
Yeah, we appreciate that, and we appreciate the trust, and we live and we learn together. I think that's really important. And I always tell people, sometimes it's also not about the donations, it's just the thought, it's the awareness, it's you spreading about Yemen on Instagram or Facebook or whatever it may be. You are going to cause a chain reaction of other people to become interested. And so that's really important, but definitely we'll definitely keep in touch. And appreciate it.
I always like to think that sharing and educating others, it's also an act of charity as well. So thank you for that. And if that's the end of our panel, I guess. Thank you so much, panelists and our audience. We had 35 at one point, so I was really happy about that. So yeah, just thank you again.
Thank you so much for this platform.
We really wish you all the luck, and we'll be more than happy to follow through. And if there's anything on Yemen, we'll have many people here that are experts on this.
Yeah, thank you for arranging this. Our contact information is always available if you ever need anything.
Thank you guys. Hope you guys have a good rest of the week. Thank the audience for being here and taking a Wednesday night to learn about a really important issue in the world. Thank you again. And yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.